I'm Andrea Kopelich, Communications Lead with CIUS, and this is Did You Know? CIUS Answers, a daily response to your questions about Russia's war with Ukraine. In response to the strong public interest to understand what is happening in Ukraine right now, CIUS experts are answering your questions. With us today is Director of CIUS, Dr. Natalia Khanenko-Friesen. Natalia, can you please share with us your response to the question, is the war in Ukraine a result of ethnic conflict?
Thank you, Andrea. Well, if you have been following the media over the last 8 years, you probably have gotten used to hearing about the conflict in Ukraine, the tensions between Russia and Ukraine, the occupation of Crimea and the so-called unrecognized republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. If you're not familiar with this part of the world and don't have ties to Ukraine or Russia, you may have come to speak about the conflict between the two as the conflict between the Russians and the Ukrainians, or the other way around. Official media, and especially social media, often resorts to exactly these adjectives, Russian and Ukrainian, to describe the standoff between the two states of Ukraine and Russia, and the current escalation in the 8-year-long military conflict, or as we say more and more frequently today, an 8-year war. Hearing the media repeat over and over again that the conflict is between Russians and Ukrainians led some of us to resort to familiar thinking that the conflict is indeed between two peoples, two nations, that the conflict is driven by some ethnic tensions that must have pre-existed in the region long before the war erupted. So is this war in Ukraine a result of ethnic conflict? Let's consider the matter from a few angles. When one hears the phrase ethnic conflict, many images surface up in our heads. We can think of the Kurds in Turkey, the Basques in Spain, the Rohingya in Myanmar, the violence against Muslims in India, which is unfolding today, the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, in which 800,000 Tutsis were exterminated. The list continues on. With each and every case of ethnic conflicts, we are all puzzled how to approach and understand them, and each and every is complex and layered. What stands out in all these cases, though, is that groups that are in conflict with each other are members of the same state, and that one of these groups finds itself in the inferior position vis-a-vis the other group. The groups that have been repressed are normally deprived of equal status in the country, do not have the same political rights and representation, find themselves economically deprived, and in weak democracies or non-democratic states, they are openly persecuted. So let's consider the case of Ukraine. In today's Ukraine, and let's just focus on the last 30 years of independent Ukraine. So in today's Ukraine, many other peoples live in addition to the Ukrainians, who indeed constitute the majority of country's population. Ukraine has many historically established ethnic minorities: Russians, Poles, Jewish people, Crimean Tatars, Bulgarians, Greeks, Hungarians, Romas, Armenians, Moldovans, Belarusians, Karems, and others. These days, Ukraine is home to other visible minorities that formed in the country because Ukraine over the last 30 years has been actively participating in various economic, cultural, and educational global networks. Many celebrities of Ukraine have biracial roots, and some are national icons, as Jean Beleniuk, a Ukrainian wrestler, gold medal Olympian, and nowadays a first Black member of the Ukrainian parliament. And Russians are the largest minority in Ukraine. Today, Ukraine's population is estimated to be at 42, 43 million. And of this, 77% or so are of Ukrainian ethnicity, and about 17% are Russian. And Ukrainian and Russian speakers make up to 67% and 29% of the population, respectively. And the reasons for the sizable Russian minority are numerous. Ukrainian lands were incorporated in the Russian Empire since the late 17th century. And the Tsarist policy of Russification, coupled with the colonial expansion into southern Ukraine and other territories, led to an increase of Russian people on the territory of Ukraine. During the Soviet rule, the policy of Russification continued, and more Russian people moved to Ukraine as a result of the Soviet systemic effort at reshuffling and displacing indigenous peoples of its various republics with the Russian population. And by indigenous people, I mean people who historically lived in their own territories. In case of Ukraine, residents of the Russian Soviet Federal Republic moved in Ukraine and Crimea following the deportations of Crimean Tatars in 1944 or Western Ukrainians after the World War II, but also following significant population losses which Ukraine endured during the World War II. Ukraine, after all, served as the largest military theater in Soviet fight against the German army in the war. And then post-war efforts at reconstructing Soviet Ukraine saw, again, further influx of those folks moving from Russia. An ethnic conflict presupposes that the titular group is discriminating against the minority people. People often think that ethnic conflicts has deep historical roots. Were the Russian people discriminated against in Soviet Ukraine? Are they being discriminated against in contemporary Ukraine? Anyone familiar with the history of Soviet Union and the leading role that the Russian nation was to play in the Soviet ethnic politics knows that in the course of the Soviet rule of almost 70 years, in each and every Soviet republic, Russian language and Russian culture, Russian literature, theater became widespread. The Russian language grew to serve as principal language of communication, and it was key to people's social mobility. In Ukraine, for example, during the Soviet times, the overwhelming majority of schools were taught in the Russian language only. University education in Ukrainian was nearly non-existent. And the overall one's professional career was to be pursued in the Russian language for the most, because it was the language of upward social mobility. Russian culture was embraced as part of the Soviet cultural heritage, so it was neither repressed nor persecuted. With the collapse of the USSR, Ukrainian culture and language enjoyed tremendous revival, and not surprisingly. Yet the Russian remained to be native language for many Ukrainians. Ukrainian book publishers continue to lament how small the Ukrainian language book sector still is. While public education in Ukraine has long transitioned to the Ukrainian language as a language of instructorship, Russian language is spoken in public, in media, and it continues to enjoy popularity. Given the historical ties between the two peoples, many people are of mixed backgrounds, intermarriage is high. Russian-speaking people enjoy the same freedoms as other Ukrainians do. At the same time, global community may still hear these days about how Ukrainians have been discriminated against, how Ukrainians have been discriminating against Russians, in Ukraine, and how Ukraine has launched an attack on the Russian language and Russian-speaking people in its country. These ideologically motivated claims, if you hear them, do not have their origin in today's Ukrainian society. These claims come from the outside and are directly informed by the Russian Federation's politics of the last 15 years or so, the beginning of which can be dated back to 2006. That's the year in which a programmatic document titled The Program of Work with Compatriots Abroad was adopted by President Putin. This new policy, and many see it as neo-imperialist, allowed the Russian Federation to reclassify all Russian-speaking people who live outside of Russia as Russian compatriots. Policies focusing on cultural reintegration of such Russian-speaking minorities into a Russian world later developed. Thus, Russian and Russian-speaking of Ukraine became labeled as Russian diaspora and became seen as part of Russian nation, of the Russian nation. And this state-sponsored campaign for this diaspora's return to the Russian cultural sphere has started. This campaign, of course, eventually gave way to a more aggressive tactics as evidenced in the occupation of Crimea in 2014 and subsequent fueling of Russian separatism in Donetsk and Luhansk region that later resulted in the creation of the two non-recognized pro-Russian territories claiming their independence from Ukraine. Today, the world continues to hear the same old rhetorics of ethnic discrimination of Russians in Ukraine. But this rhetoric is politically motivated and ideologically constructed. and it is called to serve expansionist ambitions of the current Russian government. It is important to recognize that the ongoing 8-year-long war in Ukraine is not the war based on some centuries-old ethnic tensions between Russians and Ukrainians. It is the war between the authoritarian state and its authoritarian leader who hopes to restore the old world order and build a new imperial Russian state. And it is between the Russia and the democratic state of Ukraine, a country that has chosen to adopt a European course for its development. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. Please keep your questions coming, no matter how simple or complex. We will continue to address them. We'll see you tomorrow.